All right, another exciting day in C++ land. Let's see, fasten your seat belts, keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times. I've had more than one student lose a limb in this class. Let's see, what do I want to look at? Ooh, that's a good question. Will I be going over this week's labs? Yeah, I can talk about that. Does it matter how many lines Project 2 is? No, it does not matter how many lines Project 2 is. I don't have any sort of design restrictions on that. Why am I unable to? All right, so this week's labs. What are they, 8 and 9? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to say. I can certainly talk about 9, so I don't think I have anything that I've done about 9 before. 8, I'm not sure what to say about writing a function other than one thing I can say about that is that for week 5, video bits, scope and visibility. So if you haven't watched this video, you should have watched this video. So if you're struggling with the functions, you might watch that video. It has helpful information. Otherwise, if you have specific questions about that lab, how do I get my? Nope. Stop it. I don't know why that. It's weird. I can't get. There we go. Otherwise, what the hell is going on here? If you have specific questions about that lab, the functions lab, then let me know and I'll try and answer that more directly. File output. So this one is dealing with files again, but rather than input, dealing with output. And the thing I said about file input is it's exactly the way you'd use cin, except you're doing it with the file and not with the keyboard. It's the exact same way with output, is rather than writing something to cout, you're writing it to a file. I guess it bears mentioning what exactly cin and cout are. If I asked you in general terms what FL was, you would tell me it is a variable. And then we could have a conversation about what kind of variable is and the kinds of things you can do with that variable. In this case, the kinds of things we can do with this variable is addition, subtraction, division, things of that sort. Okay? Cin and cout are variables as well. So somewhere there are lines of code that essentially look like lines 8 and 9. And so if in most general terms, what is cout and what is cin? Oh, they're variables. Well, what kind of variables or what can you do with these variables? Well, you can use that, what I've been calling the chevrons, the more strict. This would be what would be referred to as an insertion operator. And with cin, when the chevrons go this way, it would be an extraction operator. But it's just easier to just say chevrons. So what can you do with cout? Oh, you can do the insertion operator. Well, let's leave it at that. What can you do with cin? You can do the extraction operator. You can do ignore, right? There are various things we can do with that variable. The kinds of things we can do with the variable depends on the kind of thing it is, just as the kinds of things we can do with FL depends on the kind of thing. I'm using the word kind too much. The various operations we can do with cin and cout depends on the kind of thing that cin and cout are. The variety of operations we can do with FL depends on the kind of thing that FL is. All right, so that's our analogy. So when I say that writing out to a file is essentially exactly the same way as writing out to cout, that's because the kind of thing an output file is very, very closely related to the kind of thing that cout is. All right? The analogy would be, there's another type of variable, I don't recall the extent to which I've talked about it, but float and double are very closely related. A float obviously holds floating point numbers. A double also holds floating point numbers. As the name implies, it's twice as large as a regular float if you need extra precision or a larger number in general. So when I make the statement that the things you can do with double are almost exactly the same things you can do with float because they're very closely related, that's a very similar statement to me saying the things you can do with an output file variable are very similar to the things you can do with cout because they're very closely related. So let me actually prove that. Let's see, if I look at Monday, I had this assignment, ao8.cpp. I'm going to copy it to my current directory. Let's take a look at it. Okay, I have that long cout statement. I'm actually going to, just for the sake of readability, all right. So get rid of that space, and I'll put it over here. All right. So let me compile and run this just real quick. Oops. Run it twice, and then we get the whole set of output being spit out to cout. Name, please. I forgot about this. All right. So, cout is a variable for output. I want to create a variable for output to a file. For that, we have to include this. We saw from Monday that a pound include statement literally just puts a copy of the file right at that location. IO stream contains all the information we need to be able to use the variables cout and cin. Fstream contains all the information we need to be able to use input files and output files. So I'm going to create an output file variable, output file stream. I have to give it a name. That's a nice name. I have to provide a name of a file that all of the output should go to. Depending on your needs, you may either hard code it here, fancy output.text, or you may ask the user for that name and then you put that string variable here. I'm just going to hard code that. Now, anywhere I see cout, let me just make a decision whether I want that to go to the screen or to the file. So I'm going to search for cout. And I would like all of this stuff here, lines 11 through 15, to go to the file instead. So I'll say change word, and I'll write FBSA, escape. I'll go to the next one, change. I'll change all those. Let's see where our next cout is. I guess we can print the highs to the file as well for all 3 loops. The countdown stuff I'll write out to the file. And then I guess all this Barney stuff, I'll just still have it cout. And then the only thing that remains for me to do is at some point, once I'm done writing to the file, I should close the file. I could close it right here, but I think I will, just for the sake of more clearly denoting when I'm done writing to the file. I think this is the last point where I write to the file, so right here I'll close the file. So there are a couple things that we can do with OF stream variables that we don't do with cout. And one is open and one is close, right? But other than that, it's pretty much the same. I didn't really have to change any code. I just added a little bit of code to accommodate the opening and closing of the file. Let's try compiling it. Let's try running it. And then this is asking me the question, how many times do I want to print high? That message I should have written to cout, but I wrote it to the file. I'll say 2 times, please. And then these are the Barneys at the end. You can see fancy output.txt. There's that message at the beginning. How many times do I want to print high? I put the number 2, and then there's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then all the countdown stuff, and then the Barney stuff I went to cout instead of the file. That's it. That's all you got to do. Yeah.
When I was doing the lab that corresponds to this,
Right, lab 9.
I was having trouble like getting it to print to the next line. Or just like all around the stream.
Then okay, so let's look at. It's exactly like cout. So if I let's call this play with output.cpp. So if I say cout Todd cout is drinking again coffee.
Oh.
Step 1 is to admit you have a problem. All right.
Drinking coffee again.
Okay, all this is going to the same line. If I want it to go on a different lines, then I'm going to have to either put in ENDL or I'm going to have to manually put in this new line character. Now note I had this conversation with it being cout, not to a file, because if it's going to be to a file, then I would just say OF stream, out file, message.txt, and then I would change all my couts to out F, and then I would do a close when I'm done. There's nothing to the screen, but I can bring up message.txt, and there it is. So if you're not getting them on different lines like you would like, the issue is you haven't printed out a new line. Do you think it's a different cause, or does that ring true?
I think it's something else. But
Yeah, that's fine. We can look at it offline if it continues to be an issue. Other questions on that? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, this could be a stupid question.
No, that's fine. What about CN?
We're not using CN at all.
For what I have up on the screen right now, we're not using CN. If you ask me, should we use CN? I guess there are two questions. One, should you use CN with the lab? I believe the answer to that is yes, because don't you have to ask the user for a file name? So in the lab, you do have to use CN. As a general proposition, if I'm going to write a program and write out to a file, do I have to use CN? And my answer is, well, how the hell should I know? Right? You're going to have a career that spans 30 years, and you're going to have to write all sorts of applications. Whether or not you use CN at a certain point depends on, in terms of traditional software engineering, whatever the customer wants. Does the customer want you to ask a question at that point? If so, you have a CN. Otherwise, you don't.
Let's say we use CN for this lab, how is it going to affect it?
String. Some variable. I could say cout. What file would you, like to write out to? CN. And I'm going to read that into some variable. And then I'm going to change this. I'm not going to open message.text. I'm going to read in whatever they type. Excuse me, I'm going to write out to the file that they specified on line 12. Now when I run it, forgot a semicolon. Let me clear this screen. Let me run it. What file would you like to write out to? I would like to write out to happyfile.txt. And now if I do an ls, we see that happyfile.txt exists. And if I look at happyfile.txt, there's my message. Yes?
Lab wants us to ask what you want the file to be written in secondary. How do you have it do that?
Okay.
Does it need to know it's writing out something?
All right. So maybe that's a little bit poorly worded. Let me read this. So where does it say what you're saying it says?
It asks what name should we be written to at the very end.
So it says use CN to ask the user for information, and then ask the user for the name of the file. Is that what you're saying? All right. So ask the user. I guess I'm not asking the user for any information. Let me create a different. Let me tweak this one. Let me copy play with output. Let's call this asklater.cpp. All right. So let me change this. So this information, lines 8 through 13, is going to appear at the end. Well, actually, what's going to change is cout. How happy are you? Let me create a string. Happiness. CN. Cout. How happy is your neighbor? How happy string, neighbor happy. I'll use a get line for this. Get line, cn, neighbor happy. All right. So the lab says ask the user for a bunch of information. I've just asked the user for a bunch of information. Next, ask the user for the name of a file. And then here it is. Next, what would you like to write out to? And then I get it. Then I open it up. Now I have to write out happiness and neighbor happy. So this becomes happiness, and this becomes neighbor happy. And then I close the file.
You need a semicolon on
Line
line 11.
11, thank you. All right, let's try it. G++, standard. Clear the screen, run it. How happy am I? Very. Whoops, I got a problem here. A bug. I do have a CN for the happiness for the neighbor on line 14. Why did it skip it?
It's not reading the space. That.
Say that again?
It's not reading the.
You're on the right track. What did I? So how many keystrokes were there when I was asked how happy I am? How many keystrokes did I type? I did not type 4. I typed more than 4. 5. What was the 5th one? The enter key, right? I'll show you my pinky to prove it. Line 10 will read that style of reading in strings, reading in anything really. It could be a number, it doesn't have to be a string, but that style of reading in will stop the moment it sees white space, and it will not read in the white space. And white space could be a tab, it could be the space character, or it could be a new line. So when I type in vary and I hit enter, those 5 keystrokes, it reads in on line 10, it reads in VERY, and then it does not read in the new line. Okay, so that new line that I generated by hitting the enter key is still sitting there in the stream waiting to be read in. Now it traipses down and it says how happy is your neighbor, and then I hit line 14. And 14 is going to read in text happily until it encounters a new line. Well, lo and behold, the very first thing it sees is that new line that I typed after typing in vary. So it gobbles up that new line and says, okay, I'm done reading that in. So to prevent that problem, we add the cn.ignore here. Get rid of new line. Yes?
Can you demonstrate the problem one time before you fix it?
Absolutely. So it actually did the get line. I mean, we can prove it did the get line. Prove we did the get line. It certainly passes that line of code because where is it pausing at? It says, what file would you like to write out to, which is this text right here. So it definitely walked past line 15, and then it created a variable on 17, and then it spits that stuff out on 18, 19, 20, and then it pauses to have me enter in the name of the file. Now I could, let me look at a different solution. Let me actually comment this out. I don't know if I'd say a different solution, a different way of doing it. All right, so now what I've got is this stuff, and then I'm using the quote traditional chevron style of input. Let me try doing it that way. Let me compile it. Let me clear the screen. Let me run it. Now it paused. But wait, Todd. What about this whole new line stuff? Things haven't changed with the first question. You still typed in 5 keystrokes, and when it read in vary, it did not read in that new line from the enter key. That's absolutely right. So there are two things when you read in using the chevrons as shown as examples on lines 22, 16, and 10. And that is that not only does it stop when it first encounters any sort of white space, it also ignores any leading white space. So that new line was completely ignored. In fact, let me write a little program. Let me come back to this in just a moment. Ignore white space. Cn, so let me create a string, and let me just input that string. I'll give a courtesy prompt here. Please enter string, and then I do str, and then I'm going to do cout, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this little arrow here so we can see exactly where str begins and ends. Okay, and this is called ignore white space. Now when I run it, type in a bunch of spaces, hit the tab key a couple times, and then I type Bobby. So note that it ignored all of the white space prior to non-white space characters. So that's the funkiness with reading things in using the chevrons. Ignores leading white space and stops as soon as it sees white space. Yes?
If you type in a bunch of spaces after Bobby, would there be a gap between Bobby and that other arrow at the end?
So the question is, if I type in a bunch of spaces here, will there be a gap? And the answer is no, because when did it stop reading in? As soon as it encounters any kind of white space, it stops. But that means my program ended and not all of the stuff that I typed in was actually read in, right? Let me add another statement here. Let me say get line cn. I'll read it into the same variable, and let me print it out again. Now, let me clear the screen, and let me run it. I type space, 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 Bobby, space, 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 and then I hit enter, and you'll note the 3 spaces that I typed in after Bobby were sitting to be read in by line 11. Yes?
If you were to have like Bobby, space, 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 and then
Excellent question. Let's try it. Bobby, space, 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 Mary.
so if you didn't have that get line cn string, it would just read Bobby.
That's correct. If I did not have line 11, it would stop at the Y and Bobby. The 3 spaces, the Mary, and the new line after that would be sitting waiting to be read in, and then it would all just kind of go away when the program ends. Yeah?
So what this program's doing is kind of just adjusting the name.
The program's just reading in. Let me type it into a file. Todd type.text. What am I typing? I'm typing Bobby. Nope. Those are the keystrokes that I type into that program. 3 spaces, Bobby, 3 more spaces, Mary, and then a new line. So I guess let me put that. examine, let me see, it can do, all right, so that's what I type in up there. What it translates to is this stuff, ignored by CN, whatever, str, I think. And then this stuff, read in by CN, str. And then this stuff is read in by getLine cn str. So all of this stuff up through the Y and Bobby is processed by the cn chevron str. Everything else is processed by the getLine. Yeah.
So it's, like the spaces, does that kind of take care of the CN and like closes that out, and then when you just hit the one enter, it's taking care of the getLine, it just doesn't blow up at once.
Repeat it again. So when you say CN, I've got CNs on both line. Why don't you call it chevron or getLine so I can differentiate between these two? So say your question again.
Well, like it's back to the program.
Yeah, let me go back. Let me go back to the program for a minute. Oh, I know. Let me do. There we go.
So you only hit the enter one time when you type space, 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 Bobby, space, space.
That's absolutely correct. There's only one time that I hit enter when I run that program.
Is that because the CN is it all like sitting in the same spot?
Oh yeah, it ends up being a function of the terminal, and it's not a function of C++. Meaning I could, when I talk about terminal, I mean this thing right here. I can configure my terminal differently, so the moment I hit a keystroke, it goes to the program. Okay, but the way the terminal is configured is it's going to collect keystrokes until I hit the enter key, and then that entire set of characters that I typed up to and including the enter key is thrown to the program all at once. And so that's why it ends up spanning multiple CN lines.
And then follow up. So when you're using the chevrons and get to the end of the string, or you hit a new line, for example, does it not gobble it up the same way getLine is?
That's absolutely correct. When I'm using the version of CN shown on line 9, and it doesn't matter whether I'm reading, again, this is exactly the same for files, right? It doesn't matter whether I'm reading from the keyboard or a file, it's the same way. If I'm using the version of input shown on line 9, the moment it hits any whitespace character, whether it's a space, a tab, or a new line, it will stop and it will not have read in that whitespace character. Contrast that with getLine, which will gobble up the new line character and discard it. And to finally drive this home, I know that in some video I have that I discuss this, is there's an optional third argument you could provide to new line, in which case it will gobble up input up to and including an uppercase Q, in which case it'll gobble up the Q and discard it. And that would include new lines, right? I could type several lines, hitting enter, and it's only when it sees a Q will it stop reading. We're using this version of it, and this version of it is so common in the language, they provide a 2-argument version of getLine where I don't have to specify a new line, and it's just assumed to be a new line there. All right. Let me rename this. toddtype.text, let me call that, let me move toddtype.text to be input for ignore whitespace program. It's a long name, but at least that when I post the notes, that'll tie that file to the CPP file. In fact, whoops. Yeah, Matt.
So why is the first CN function
I'm sorry. Why is the first CN function? You talking about line 9?
yeah, I'm talking about where it's a space, space, space.
Oh,
No, in the other, yeah. Why is that being ignored in the other one?
that's just. I don't have a good answer for why, other than to say that's just how, when you do the version of CN shown on line 9, that's just how that behaves, is it will automatically ignore any white space. Whether it is spaces, tabs, or new lines, it will ignore them.
Will that always be the case then?
Yeah, by that's the it'll always be the case if you use this chevron version of input. Yeah.
If you're using CN dot ignore and in the parentheses, can you put something in the parentheses if you want?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. So the question is, when I won't write it out to this file, but I'll type it in. If I do cn.ignore, or if I'm input from a file, it would be the same way. Can I put a number here? Yes. What that number represents is the number of characters to ignore. So if it's empty, then what is implied is that that number is 1. Other questions? Yeah, I can go over that. Can you replace a CN with outf to get the user's input to go to the file you listed? If I understand correctly, can I replace CN with input from a file rather than input from the keyboard? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I could write a program where I replace all CNs and COUTs with input files and output files. And yeah, that would be just fine to do that. If I understand that correctly, yes, that'd be fine. Yes? Can I have user input be written to a file? Can I write user input to a file? Only if I'm explicit about it. Right, it isn't going to happen automatically, but you can certainly take any input and then write it out to a file. And keep in mind, you can have multiple files open. So maybe you want to do that, and you can open up an output file for whatever it is you're writing, all the movie information, but then you could open another output file to write everything that the user types in, and then you'd have 2 output files. So you can certainly do that. But it isn't going to happen automatically. You're going to have your program do that. How did I search for and highlight all the cout variables? To search in Vim, so if I search for SA, and for next, and it'll wrap around. Once I hit the bottom, you'll see this message here, search hit bottom, continuing at top, so it'll wrap around your file. You can use question mark. Let's go to the next match in the backward direction. So everything gets reversed if you use a question mark instead of a slash. Uppercase N, lowercase n. To stop the highlighting, it gets irritating because the highlighting doesn't turn off automatically. So in a header file, for example, hexagon.h. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry that I didn't do this before, but it finally struck to me as reflecting yesterday on that assignment where you're doing the hexagons in C++. And what makes that assignment most frustrating is you don't know where your pointer ended up and which way it's facing, right? So I actually tweaked the library, and now it puts a little red triangle where your pointer ends up. So I'm sorry I didn't have that for you, but the next semester will benefit. But your struggles, you see, your struggles inspired that. And just to say it, there have been a lot of struggles over the years, and there are all sorts of things that have gone smoothly for you because of the pain previous semesters have suffered. So let's throw that out there. So when you go to bed tonight, be sure to give thanks to previous semesters of 111. All right. And what does the stuff after the end kind of define mean? Does it actually do anything, or is it for naming something? I can talk about that. This was let me deal with this one. Hello. All right. Well, I think I did that. All right, now I'm getting to the hard ones. I think I need to wait on the reference versus value. I'm not going to have time in the next 6 minutes to do that. I can talk very briefly about hexagon.h. I need to think about what I want to say real quick. All right. That isn't going to work. Yeah. So the deal with header files is, as I said, the purpose of header files is merely to provide information for the compiler should you decide to use it. And the example which we've seen is function prototypes. So when you're going to write a function, bool compare to 10, and it takes a couple integers, this prototype is information for the compiler. If you're going to use that in a larger application with multiple files, and I believe it's as soon as next week where we talk about multiple files, you don't want to type this in every CPP file that you create that is going to be calling this function. So the thing to do instead is to put this function prototype in a header file, and then you just pound include the header file. Yes? A header file, a CPP file would be the source code that contains the definitions of functions, the creation of variables, the code that does stuff. Header files in general only contain information for the compiler, such as line 9. Note that line 9 doesn't tell you what compare to 10 does. It just tells you that it exists, what it returns, and what it takes as input parameters. Okay? So header file is just give the compiler enough information to allow you to use it. It doesn't tell you what things do. Yes? No. So that's an excellent question. A header file should not create anything. It should not define a function. It should not create a variable. If you do that in a header file, you got big problems down the road. All that goes into the CPP file. So with that as preamble, if you're going to be putting things in header files that you're going to pound include in several different places, the problem is with some things, and I have to introduce something we haven't talked about yet. It is an error to tell the compiler more than once what something is. Not in all cases. You saw me here testing. I did the compare to 10. What did I do? I did some like int FDSA, and then I did something like this, and I copied it, and I tried compiling, and it worked. To tell the compiler what a function does more than once is not a problem. But to tell the compiler that I have a class called FDSA, we don't know what a class is, that's fine, don't sweat it, we'll learn soon enough. But for me, this is, again, this doesn't create anything, this is just information for the compiler, like a function prototype. For me to tell the compiler this more than once pisses the compiler off. And if I try compiling fdsa.cpp, we can see it gives me an error and says, hey, you're redefining that, you're not allowed to do that, you jerk. So this is something that I want to put in a header file. However, let me take lines 3 and 4 and write it to fdsa.h. Let me look at that. So now I'm going to pound include fdsa.h. If I include fdsa.h more than once, again, that just contains that class declaration. I should get the exact same error. Yeah, it's basically, it's heading me off at the pass, telling me what I need to do to prevent the problem that I'm about to introduce. The way I avoid including this more than once is I say pound if not the n is key. The n is absolutely key. It means not. If I've not defined, and I can put anything I want here, then please define that. This is just something for the preprocessor. So what happens the very first time I pound include this? Has it ever seen XXXXX? No. So it's going to define it, and then I get a copy of that in my file. But what if I pound include it again? Has XXX been defined? Yes, because we just now included it. So it immediately skips down to line 5. So they're what are referred to as header guards. It prevents you from accidentally including a header file more than once. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, well, I chose XXX, what should it be? By convention, the question is you have to come up with some sort of word that hasn't been used, because your application may literally have dozens of header files, right? And you don't want to have to try and figure out, well, I've used X's, I can use Y's. The easy way is just give it the name of the file, FDSA, and a period isn't allowed in these, so normally you substitute the period with an underscore. And that is not required by the language, that is just by convention, because it's guaranteed to be unique, right? So that's that. It's not important that you memorize that or anything, but that answers that question. All right, we'll see you in lab, and come here on Friday for an assignment.